There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They don't come with warning sirens or flashing lights. They arrive quietly, a phone call, a knock, a message, and in the space of a single breath, your entire world changes shape forever. For Don Henley, one of the most celebrated musicians in rock history, that moment came on January 18, 2016. A cold Monday morning. And when the news hit him, it wasn't just the loss of a friend or a bandmate. It was the loss of the man who had literally made him who he was. The man without whom there would have been no Hotel California, no Desperado, no Heartache Tonight, no Eagles. Don Henley lost Glenn Frey that day, and in a very real sense, a piece of himself went with him. This is the story of that loss, that friendship, that brotherhood, and why Don Henley, even years later, struggles to fully put it into words. Before we get to the grief, we have to understand the bond. Because you cannot truly feel the weight of what Henley lost without first understanding what Glenn Frey meant to him, not just as a musical partner, but as a human being who shaped the very DNA of who Don Henley became. And to do that, we have to go back. All the way back to 1970. To a dusty, smoky Los Angeles music scene. To two young men who had absolutely no idea that fate, if that's even the right word, was about to arrange a collision that would change rock and roll forever. Don Henley was born in Gilmer, Texas, in 1947. He was a small-town kid with a big sound, a boy who fell in love with the drums and the radio, who dreamed of something larger than the world he was born into. He moved to Los Angeles in the early 1970s, chasing music, chasing a dream he couldn't quite name yet. Glenn Frey, on the other hand, was a Detroit boy. Born in 1948 in Royal Oak, Michigan, sharp-tongued, street-smart, full of fire and ambition that rolled off him like heat off pavement in July. Glenn had already been kicking around the LA music scene for a couple of years when these two paths first intersected. They met at a party at the legendary Troubadour Club in West Hollywood. Two musicians. Two strangers. Two halves of something neither of them had even imagined yet. Glenn Frey was performing at the club, and someone in the crowd, the right person, at the right time, pointed Henley out to him. A mutual friend connected them. And just like that, something started. Something neither of them could have predicted, controlled, or stopped. The real magic, though, the incubator where the Eagles were truly born, was Linda Ronstadt's backing band. It was 1971. Linda Ronstadt was already a rising star, a stunning voice from Tucson, Arizona, who had been making waves in the folk country rock scene that was exploding in California at the time. Her manager, John Boylan, was assembling a band for her summer tour, and he hired Glenn Frey to play rhythm guitar and sing backup. When Boylan reached out to Henley, he joined too, as the drummer. Suddenly, Frey and Henley were on the road together, night after night, sharing stages and cramped vans and long conversations about music and life and ambition. And what started as a professional arrangement became something much deeper. They pushed each other. They challenged each other. They shared a vision, an instinct, for what rock music could and should be. And by the time that tour was winding down, the two of them were already talking about breaking away, forming their own group, doing something entirely on their own terms. Glenn Frey brought in Bernie Leadon, a multi-instrumentalist with bluegrass roots, and Randy Meisner, a powerful vocalist and bassist. Together with Henley and Frey, they became the Eagles. The name itself came to Frey during a peyote trip in the Mojave Desert, an eagle soaring overhead, a symbol so perfect it felt like the universe was writing the band's destiny for them. They signed with David Geffen's Asylum Records, one of the most forward-thinking record labels of the era, and began recording. Their debut album came out in 1972, and the sound was immediately distinctive. Country-tinged, sun-drenched California rock, with those soaring, spine-tingling harmonies that only came from voices that had lived together long enough to blend like water. They weren't just a band. They were a sound. And that sound was spreading. The early years were not without conflict. This is important to understand, because the story of Don Henley and Glenn Frey is not a simple, uncomplicated love story. It is a story of two enormous personalities, two brilliant, stubborn, fiercely opinionated men, who were constantly, perpetually, exhaustingly in each other's way. Don Henley was introspective, poetic, cerebral. Glenn Frey was extroverted, aggressive, tactical. Henley processed the world through his lyrics. Frey processed it through his ambition. They argued. God, they argued. About songs, about direction, about money, about credit, about absolutely everything. There were moments when it seemed impossible that these two men could stay in the same room together, let alone the same band. But here is the thing, and this is what makes their story so extraordinary: the fighting made the music better. The tension between them created friction, and that friction generated sparks, and those sparks caught fire and burned into songs that outlived every argument that ever started them. By 1977, the Eagles had become one of the biggest bands in the world. Their album Hotel California was released that year, and it was nothing short of a cultural earthquake. The title track, that haunting, unmistakable guitar riff from Don Felder, those dark, poetic lyrics written by Henley and Frey, became one of the most analyzed, most debated, most beloved songs in rock history. Henley has said that the song was an allegory about the American dream, about excess, about ambition, about the seductive trap of success. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. Looking back on those words now, knowing what eventually happened to the band and to Glenn Frey, those lines carry a weight they never could have had when they were first written. The Eagles had checked in. And for a long, long time, they couldn't check out. But nothing lasts forever. Not even the Eagles. The tension that had always powered the band began to curdle into something darker by the late 1970s. The drug use, the ego battles, the money disputes, the constant pressure of performing at a level so high it left no room for anything human, it was all taking its toll. And then, on July 31, 1980, during a benefit concert in Long Beach, California, something finally snapped. Glenn Frey and guitarist Don Felder had been at each other's throats for years. The friction between them had become unbearable. During the show that night, on stage, in front of a full audience, they threatened each other. Physically. Loudly. In a way that made it crystal clear, this was over. After the concert, the band met, and it was done. The Eagles broke up that night, in the parking lot of the Long Beach Arena, and Don Henley told a reporter with his characteristic dry wit that they'd play together again when hell freezes over. 14 years later, hell froze over. In 1994, the Eagles reunited for what became one of the most iconic comeback tours in rock history, aptly titled Hell Freezes Over. Don Henley, Glenn Frey, Don Felder, Joe Walsh, and Timothy B. Schmidt, all of them, back on stage. The live album from that tour became a massive hit, debuting at #1 on the charts. It proved that the music was bigger than the egos, bigger than the fights, bigger than all of it. And it reignited something between Henley and Frey, a partnership that had never truly died, even during all those years apart. They continued to tour, to record, to be the Eagles. And through all of it, the core of the band remained the Henley-Frey axis. Those two men, those two enormous, complicated, brilliant, infuriating personalities, holding the whole thing together through sheer force of will and an undeniable musical chemistry that simply could not be replicated. Then the illness came. Glenn Frey had been quietly battling rheumatoid arthritis for more than 15 years. Most fans had no idea. He had managed it, medicated it, pushed through it, because that was who Glenn Frey was, a man who did not surrender, not to critics, not to bandmates, not even to his own body. But in late 2015, things took a serious turn. The medications he was taking for the rheumatoid arthritis began to have dangerous side effects. He developed acute ulcerative colitis, a devastating inflammation of the intestines. And then, as if his body had simply had enough, pneumonia set in on top of everything else. He was admitted to a New York hospital, and for several weeks, those closest to him held on to hope. They prayed. They waited. They told themselves this was Glenn Frey, the toughest man any of them had ever known, and he was going to fight his way out of this, the same way he had fought his way through everything else in his extraordinary life. He didn't make it out. On January 18, 2016, Glenn Lewis Frey, co-founder of the Eagles, guitarist, vocalist, composer, visionary, troublemaker, sparkplug, and one of the most consequential figures in the history of American popular music, died in New York City. He was 67 years old. The world found out through a statement from the band. And then the world went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from indifference, the kind of quiet that comes from shock so deep it rings out all sound. Radio stations played Eagles songs on loop. Social media filled with tributes. Rock legends who had spent decades competing with the Eagles posted their grief without hesitation. And in a house somewhere, Don Henley, the man who had argued with Glenn Frey and made music with Glenn Frey and broken up with Glenn Frey and reunited with Glenn Frey and stood on stages around the world next to Glenn Frey for more than 4 decades, sat with the news that his partner was gone. The statement that Don Henley released in the hours after Glenn's death has to be one of the most honest, beautiful, painful tributes ever written by one musician about another. He didn't sanitize it. He didn't make it smaller or safer than it was. He said, "He was like a brother to me. We were family. And like most families, there was some dysfunction." That single sentence, "like most families, there was some dysfunction," carried a universe of shared history inside it. The fights. The grudges. The years apart. The moments where they genuinely couldn't stand each other. He wasn't pretending those things hadn't happened. He was acknowledging them, and then saying, it didn't matter. None of it mattered. He was my brother. And then Henley wrote something that stopped everyone who read it cold. He wrote, "I'm not sure I believe in fate, but I know that crossing paths with Glenn Lewis Frey in 1970 changed my life forever, and it eventually had an impact on the lives of millions of other people all over the planet." Let that land for a moment. Don Henley, a man who spent 5 decades at the very top of rock music, a man whose solo career alone produced hits like Boys of Summer and Dirty Laundry and The Heart of the Matter, looked at his entire life and said the most defining thing that ever happened to him was meeting Glenn Frey. He didn't stop there. He said something about Glenn that has stayed with every Eagles fan who heard it. He called Glenn the spark plug, the man with the plan. He said Glenn had an encyclopedic knowledge of popular music and boundless enthusiasm. He said Glenn was the one who started it all. And in saying that, Henley wasn't diminishing his own contribution, not at all. He was pointing at something real. The Eagles, as a concept, as an entity, as a force, it originated in Glenn Frey's imagination. He was the one who pushed, who drove, who refused to let the idea die even when it seemed impossible. And Henley, who provided so much of the soul and the poetry of the band's music, was acknowledging what he knew better than anyone. That without Glenn Frey's fire, none of the music that defined a generation would have ever been made. In the days, weeks, and months that followed Glenn's death, Don Henley was in a kind of limbo that he has since described with devastating honesty. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know who the Eagles were without Glenn Frey. He said, plainly, that in those dark early months, he was ready to walk away. Ready to set down the drumsticks for good. The Eagles died the day Glenn Frey passed away, he said. And he meant it. The band he had given 50 years of his life to, the band that had defined his identity more thoroughly than anything else, felt to him like something that had ended, not just paused. What do you do when the thing you built your whole life around is suddenly gone? When the person who sat across from you in every creative battle, every artistic decision, every moment of triumph and failure, when that person is no longer there, you sit in the silence and you wonder if you can go on. And for a long time, Don Henley wasn't sure he could. What helped him decide otherwise was something profound. Something that speaks to who Glenn Frey was as a father, as a man, and what he left behind beyond the music. Don Henley eventually told his remaining bandmates, Joe Walsh and Timothy B. Schmidt, that there was only one condition under which he would consider continuing the Eagles. He said, "I'll only do it if we can get Glenn's son." I wanted the blood. He wanted Deacon Frey, Glenn's son, to be part of whatever came next. Because if they were going to carry the Eagles forward without Glenn, then the most honest way to do it was to bring in the person who carried Glenn's blood, Glenn's face, Glenn's voice, Glenn's DNA. Deacon Frey joined the band, and veteran country musician Vince Gill came in as well, and in 2017, the Eagles went back out into the world. Not as a replacement for what they had been, nothing could replace that, but as a tribute, a continuation, an act of love for everything Glenn Frey had built. Watching Deacon Frey on that stage, young, earnest, carrying himself with the ease and confidence of a young man who had grown up around some of the greatest musicians alive, was, by all accounts, deeply emotional for everyone involved. Especially for Don Henley. Here was Glenn's son, standing where his father had stood, singing songs his father had written, breathing life back into something that had seemed finished forever. Henley, sitting behind his drum kit, watching this young man carry his father's legacy forward, must have felt the full weight and the full grace of that moment in a way that defies any easy description. Music, at its best, does that. It carries the dead forward into the future. It keeps the conversation going even when the voice that started it is silent. In a deeply emotional interview with CBS Sunday Morning, Don Henley revisited all of these memories with a rawness and honesty that was almost hard to watch. He spoke about Glenn not as a legend but as a person, complicated, brilliant, maddening, irreplaceable. He talked about their first meeting with the kind of quiet wonder of a man who still cannot quite believe how the whole thing happened. Two guys who should never have ended up in the same room together, who became, through some chain of improbable events, the most important creative partnership in each other's lives. He talked about the fights without shame, because the fights were part of the truth. He talked about the music with the reverence of a man who knows, in his bones, that he was part of something that doesn't come around often. Once in a generation, maybe. Once in a lifetime, certainly. He talked about the silence that came after Glenn's death, the particular aching silence of losing someone who was both your greatest ally and your fiercest opposition. When Glenn was alive, even when they weren't speaking, Henley always knew he was there. Somewhere. In a studio, on a stage, in a hotel room, on a tour bus, Glenn Frey was out there in the world, and that fact alone was a kind of anchor. Losing that anchor doesn't just make you sad. It makes you drift. And Don Henley drifted for a long time after January 18, 2016. Trying to find his footing in a world that had reorganized itself without his partner in it. He also spoke, carefully, guardedly, but honestly, about something that the music industry rarely talks about openly, the guilt. The quiet, persistent guilt that survivors carry. The arguments they wished they'd never had. The words they wished they'd said differently. The shows where the tension between them was so thick it could have been cut with a blade, and which now, in retrospect, feel like wasted time. When you lose someone, all the fights look different. All the silences look different. You start to wonder if you said it enough, that you loved them, that you were grateful for them, that you knew what they meant to you. And Henley, to his credit, doesn't pretend that he always did. He said it plainly. Their relationship was complicated, it was messy, it was real, and it was one of the most important things in his life. Not despite the complications. Sometimes because of them. The Eagles' legacy, now in the era of the long goodbye farewell tour, is something that Don Henley has had to wrestle with in a new way since Glenn's passing. How do you honor a legacy that belonged to both of you? How do you step onto a stage and represent something that was built by two people, when one of those people is no longer there? These are not small questions. They are the kinds of questions that keep musicians up at night, that haunt the space between the last chord of a concert and the quiet of an empty dressing room. Henley has answered them the only way he knows how, by going back out, by playing the music, by letting the songs speak for themselves. Because the songs don't know that Glenn is gone. The songs are still alive, exactly as they were, carrying every note and every word that Glenn Frey put into them. There is a particular song that has taken on a new resonance in the years since Glenn Frey's death. Desperado, written by Henley and Frey together, one of the first songs they ever wrote as collaborators, recorded for the Eagles' 1973 album. It is a song about a man who won't let anyone in, who rides alone, who mistakes freedom for isolation. Desperado, why don't you come to your senses? You've been out riding fences for so long now. When Henley performs that song today, you wonder how it feels to sing words that he wrote with Glenn Frey about a man who keeps everyone at arm's length, to an audience that knows what they know about who Glenn was and who they were to each other. You wonder if those words mean something different now. You wonder if they mean everything. And what about Hotel California? That crowning achievement, that pinnacle of their art together. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. Glenn Frey has checked out now. But has he left? Listen to any radio station on any day of the week, in any country in the world, and you'll hear the Eagles. You'll hear Glenn Frey's voice, clear and warm and unapologetically American, carrying a melody that time has not touched. He hasn't left. He's still there in the music, the way he always was, doing what Don Henley said he did for the whole band from the very beginning, providing the spark, the light, the thing that keeps the fire going long after the man himself has gone quiet. Don Henley is in his late 70s now. He has lived a remarkable life, a life of music and controversy and triumph and heartbreak, of creative battles and commercial glory and personal struggles that have been well documented in the press over the decades. He has seen everything the music industry has to offer, from the chaotic creative freedom of the 1970s to the fractured, algorithm-driven streaming world of today. He has outlasted trends, outlasted critics, outlasted the various deaths and rebirths of classic rock itself. But the thing he cannot outlast, the thing none of us can outlast, is the loss of someone we love. And whatever the complications, whatever the history, whatever the fights and the silences and the years of estrangement, Don Henley loved Glenn Frey. He loved him the way you love a person who built the most important parts of your world. In his recent interview on CBS Sunday Morning, anchored by Tracy Smith in early 2025, Henley sat quietly and talked about the Eagles' miraculous run, his words. Miraculous. A man who has been famous for 50 years, who won Grammys and sold out stadiums and been celebrated by presidents and poets, and the word he reaches for is miraculous. Because even now, even after everything, he can still barely believe that it happened. That two guys from Texas and Michigan, thrown together by circumstance in someone else's backing band, managed to create music that is still being heard, still being felt, still being sung along to, 5 decades later. He called it miraculous, and you believe him, because you can hear in his voice that he means it without irony. He knows how rare it was. He knows how much of it he owes to the man who is no longer here. At one point in that interview, Henley was asked about the Eagles continuing, about whether it still feels right to go out under that name, to carry that brand forward, without Glenn. And his answer was characteristically complicated, and characteristically honest. He said it was hard. He said it would always be hard. He said there is no version of the Eagles that feels complete without Glenn Frey, and that he knows that, and that he thinks the audiences know it too. But he also said that the music is bigger than any of them. That the songs they made together have a life of their own, and that life belongs to the people who love them, not just to the men who made them. And so he goes out. He plays. He sings Desperado and Hotel California and Take It Easy and Heartache Tonight, and he carries Glenn Frey's voice in the arrangements and in the harmonies and in the very structure of the songs, and that is how he keeps faith with his friend. That is how he honors the brother he lost. As we move toward the end of the long goodbye, the Eagles' farewell tour, now in its final acts, with dates announced for 2026 that carry the weight of true finality, there is a bittersweet quality to everything Don Henley does and says in public. He is a man in the process of closing something enormous. Saying goodbye not just to the stage, not just to the audiences, not just to the decades of touring and recording and fighting and creating, but saying goodbye to a whole chapter of human experience that cannot be repeated or replaced. And at the center of that goodbye is the absence of Glenn Frey. The chair that is always, in some sense, empty. The voice that is always, in some sense, still echoing. Don Henley once said that he's not sure he believes in fate. But he also said that meeting Glenn Frey changed his life forever. Those two things are not contradictions. They are the same sentence spoken in two different languages. Whether it was fate or accident, chance or design, the meeting of those two men in Los Angeles in 1970 produced something that nobody planned and nobody predicted and nobody, not even them, fully understood until it was already finished. They gave the world Hotel California and Desperado and Take It Easy and countless other songs that have been the soundtrack to generations of lives. They gave the world the Eagles. And when Glenn Frey died on that January morning in 2016, the world lost not just a musician, but a force. A specific, irreplaceable energy that had been burning for 45 years, that had lit up stages on every continent, that had turned two ordinary young men into something genuinely extraordinary. Don Henley is still here. Still drumming. Still singing. Still carrying the whole story forward with the quiet, stubborn dignity of a man who knows his job is not finished yet. But every time he sits behind that drum kit, every time the opening chords of Hotel California ring out into a stadium full of people who have been waiting their whole lives to hear that song live, he carries something invisible with him. A presence. A partnership. A ghost that is entirely welcome. And if you look carefully, if you really look, you can see it in his face. The grief that never fully leaves. The gratitude that never fully runs out. The love that looks exactly like loss, and the loss that looks exactly like love, because in the end, between those who truly know each other, the two things are the same. Glenn Frey, the eagle that fell, the spark that didn't go out, the man with the plan, may have left the building. But as any Eagles fan will tell you, as Don Henley himself will tell you, in the only way that truly matters, he never left at all.